I got to interview Jim Nabors. I was writing for a TV Guide's website, and I interviewed him. He was living at his macadamia ranch in Hawaii, and he was a very nice guy. I forget what we were interviewing him about, but at the end of the call, he said, well, you should come visit me at the ranch. And I said, well, thank you, just figuring he's just being nice. And he said, no, you're in New York. You could go right to Newark Airport. And I had been talking with this man for maybe, 20 minutes. And and all of a sudden I was being invited. I really should have taken him up on it. That was a missed opportunity.
Did you seriously consider that offer?
I guess briefly I did, but, at the same time, it just felt a little weird to me, just going out to Hawaii to be with Jim Nabors alone on his macadamia ranch. I mean, I might never be heard from again.
Yeah, but I mean, as far as going on podcasts in 30 years, much better story that I didn't take Jim Nabors up on the offer. I'm kind of amazed sort of looking at the early trajectory of your career, the number of opportunities that were afforded to you with this really strange and singular cable access show.
Well, if you were living in New York at that time, I don't know how singular we were. There was a lot of very strange programming on public access back then. It was great. It was really rich with all sorts of eccentrics with their own shows. And so we went into that environment, something as a tribute almost to these shows, and thought it would be fun to just kind of slip in between them and be yet another one of those, but maybe offer a little something more and maybe a little more confusion about what we were doing was real and what was not real. And yeah, we were having fun with it.
I mean, it is clearly an homage, right down to the fact you will have people from those shows on, and that there are several instances where you did reference some of the other shows that were happening at the time. And those, and the beauty of YouTube right now is those are other rabbit holes that you can continue to go down. But I mean, you obviously, I assume David as well, probably most of the crew were pretty self-aware.
To varying degrees. I think David, who, my co-host on the show, has his share of eccentricities. Sometimes people will, talk to me, friends, whatever, and say, well, you're weird too, right? And I'm like, well, no, wait, what? So, I guess we did have some awareness for sure about the probably a little more awareness than some of the other public access hosts that we were sharing the channel with, but I think, yeah, we had our own peculiarities in our own ways.
Insofar as you're able to talk about them, what David's peculiarities were. Is he really sort of the strong silent type, the way he is on the show?
No, David is, he does speak, and he, we met back at NYU. We were going to school together, and he was actually showed up in my very first class. I made the mistake of taking Introduction to Philosophy, thinking that, I'll broaden my mind. I had no idea what was going on in there. The teacher was talking about, will this chair still be in the room when we leave? And I have a hard time with those kinds of discussions.
Conceptual.
So, yeah. And David was in that class. Now, David, on the other hand, loved that class and excelled in that class. And, but he was this, very tall guy that would show up carrying his Barnes and Noble book bag. And he would always show up at the class about 5 minutes before the ending bell. And, so the professor would be speaking and we'd all be in this big lecture hall. And David would come in 5 minutes before the end while the professor's speaking, and, with his tall, lanky body would walk all the way up to the back of the classroom and sit down, and the class would be over. And he did this consistently every class. So I, even in high school, was attracted to eccentrics, and I would, embrace a lot of eccentrics that I would meet going to talent shows, and I was looking for a lot of that in entertainment and enjoying people like Tiny Tim and like that. So it was kind of natural that I struck up a conversation with David, and we wound up. I eventually joined the student humor magazine, The Plague, and David was active in the student organizations too. So we ended up just hanging out a lot together in school, and the character that he played on the show kind of grew out of him in school, kind of playing around with these characters. He would call himself Mr. Serious, and no one could get through to him. You try talking to him and he'd give very serious responses, and that might go on for, a day. Then there was Mr. Very Serious, and he was really curt. So, when it came time to do the show, it was like, oh, why don't we have Mr. Serious, be the co-host? And that's kind of how we got together on that.
I mean, he's not only has a hair trigger, but is also prone to violence on the show.
Yeah. He was prone to violence, at times more to my liking. But there was no controlling what David would do on the show. And so sometimes it would, get uncomfortable, truly uncomfortable. And we had William Gaines on, the publisher of Mad Magazine. It was a thrill for me and an honor to have him there. And at the end of the show, David was like getting into some fight with the puppets behind him, and he ended up like climbing up on the couch, on the back of the couch, right behind William Gaines, this was about 9 months before the man died. He was an older guy, and I'm just, I'm trying to kind of keep things going, but trying to make that stop at the same time, hoping that he doesn't step on William Gaines. And so, that stuff was, created some genuine tension on the show.
I'm thinking of that famous Crispin Glover Letterman interview. He has the platform shoes on. I think he was also in character from a movie that he wasn't promoting at the time, and comes like dramatically close to Letterman's face with a kick. And there are certain things that you can watch and it's clear that like you can't this couldn't have been planned, and that this was like not only on the fly, but that the person was risking grievous bodily harm in the process.
Yeah, there definitely was that edge to David. And, but to speak with him in person, he'd be very nice. He would be very nice to the guests prior to the taping. He would often book the celebrity guests that we'd have on the show. The criteria was usually that they would have their phone number listed in the phone book. And I'd pass it along to David and say, David, work your magic. And he would call these people consistently and never take no for an answer. Well, he would reluctantly take no for an answer, but he would always be very nice to them. And, but yeah, if you were to speak with him in person, you'd find him to be a pleasant, somewhat eccentric guy.
And we can talk about Oddville a little bit later. Obviously, a very different platform, but the spectrum of guests on Beyond Vaudeville is really incredible. There are some people who, on the face of it, make a lot of sense. Joe Franklin, obviously, like kind of a big deal in New York and in that world,
and a hero of mine since childhood. I mean, I loved his show. It just He instilled a lot of people from my generation who found him, really got us interested in nostalgia and the idea of a guest couch that could include a wide variety of people from all walks of life and interacting with everyone. And it was, part of what was so much fun for us doing the show was meeting these heroes. He was one of them.
There's some people who are clear, like, just knowing what I know about this person, it's clear that they sort of understand what the joke is, and they're there because, Tom Arnold, Fred Willard, like in those cases. You mentioned Tim, again, somebody who really makes sense in that world. But I watched 2 last night as a partial preparation for this conversation. They're 2 very different people, and I want to talk about both of them specifically and start with Soleil Moonfry, who was still very young. I think she was probably like 18 or 19 at the time. She was still relatively fresh off of Punky Brewster. It's not entirely clear watching it whether she kind of was in on it or was just really, really nice.
Wow, what's going on over here?
David, let her know she'd be welcome. That
David,
would be a nice thing for you to do.
I'd love it.
Okay.
Well, she was very nice. When we would book people on the show, it really would just be presented as, it's going to be a talk variety show. And these are the guests we've had. And we had, especially over time, we would build up a nice guest list. We had 2 Oscar winners, Kim Hunter and Shirley Jones. And we had, a bunch of accomplished people that were on the show. Imogen Coca, legends, some of these people. So, and there usually wasn't a lot of time with them hanging around. It would kind of be like, bring them into the studio. Okay, you're on, and so, in a lot of cases, you kind of see their surprise as the guest lineup,
real-time reaction to what's going on around them.
Yeah, in many cases. Occasionally, one of the other guests would get to one of the celebrity guests before we started rolling, and that could be problematic sometimes. We had a frequent guest on the show, William Brown, who we billed as our Renaissance man, and William is an eccentric himself. He likes to count out grooves on vinyl record albums. He would go into record stores in New York and just flip through albums just to take them out and take his pica ruler and measure the out grooves of each album. He also knew every model who ever appeared on the Benny Hill show, and I think to most of us, we'd think maybe there were, a half dozen. Well, no, he had figured out every one of them that had ever appeared on the show and had this big stack of stat sheets on each one. And so he had these interesting obsessions. Anyway, I digress, but the reason I bring him up is we were going to have as a guest Kitty Carlisle Hart, who had been very accomplished. At this point, she had really risen to the top of society in New York, and she was like on the state arts board, and she was in her youth. She was in a Marx Brothers movie. She really was accomplished, and so we were setting up our set. We always had just a few minutes to kind of get that set together. One of the guys working on the show said, "Rich, come here. You got to help. William Brown has Kitty cornered in a kitty cornered." So, I ran over. I had Kitty's autobiography. I had just read it. I always did my research, and I said, "Oh, Miss Hart, it's such a pleasure to have you here." And so I was able to kind of pull her out of that situation, but she had some hesitancy. But then as I, right before we went on, I had mentioned some of the things I had read in her book. So she could tell I cared about her career and was interested in it. And so she so she had a little awareness, I guess, when she came on.
One thing I've always sort of been curious about is whether there's an extent to which the Frank Hope character almost works against you, in that, obviously not a professional interviewer. And I assume somebody comes on, somebody's won an Oscar, and there's this guy stammering through questions. Can probably be pretty difficult to break through.
Yeah, it was a balancing act, because I really would research the guests as best I could, especially at the time. We didn't have, wide internet access. And, so, I would go into those interviews with a lot of notes about them, but at the same time, we had the three-ring circus going on. The puppets were there, and I had to make sure I had time to get Joey the monkey to come in and dance. So I think, a number of them, I hope, could tell my intent was good, and I had the information in front of me. It was just, how well I'd be able to get to that information and still bring out the nose whistler.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, was the end product better if the guest was in on the joke?
It all depended on the type of person. I think in the case of the late Fred Willard, who was just incredible, and was another hero from his Fernwood Tonight show, like in a case of like Fred's or Tom Arnold, they're comedians who, really brought their game to the table. And same with like Professor Erwin Corey and Brother Theodore, these really incredibly accomplished comedians who saw the situation and then played with it. And, we were the mouse to these cats, and but then on the other hand, it was interesting to have people that weren't quite prepared for that. We had Austin Pendleton on, who just seemed, really confused by it all, and made for kind of an interesting interview and show. I thought, I asked him something somewhere, toward the end of the show that he was on, oh, you're having a good time, Mr. Pendleton. And he just kind of stammered and said, I'm not used to this. That was to me, that's a more interesting response than what you see on a lot of talk shows, especially today, where it's like the questions and answers are just so tightly prepared, and there's so much input by the publicity teams for whatever project's being promoted. And, so for me anyway, that kind of raw response is way more interesting to me as a viewer.
Confusion is better than anger.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know that we ever had anyone truly, angry with us. We did have some guests leave before even coming on the show. We had Karen Lynn Gorney was booked. She was the actress from Saturday Night Fever. And I think her grandfather wrote Pennies from Heaven or something. So it was all ready for the interview. And she came in and, looked in our little studio at what we were setting up. And she told one of the guys, is there a soda machine here? And they were like, no, she said, oh, well, I'm going to go down the block and get a soda. And I don't know whether or not she ever got the soda, but she never came back. So
it's like leaving to get a pack of cigarettes.
Yeah. So I don't even remember what episode that was, but chances are there wasn't a celebrity guest on that one. Sometimes we'd have more than one celebrity guest on a show, and that was usually because we feared one of them might not show up, and we wanted to, make sure we had a backup. And who else? Oh, and Sammy Shore also had shown up, had a similar reaction. He looked around and he said, I'm not doing this shit. And but we had to start the show. The studio, we were always booked back to back to back with other shows.
So it wasn't live, but you just had a window.
Correct. Yeah. And it was, but I mean, it was essentially live on tape. Like we never stopped, and just go with whatever happened. So it seemed like, he wasn't going to cooperate and come on, and we had to start the show. So I started. I think I even announced his name in the beginning of the show in hopes that he was going to come on. And meanwhile, in another room, John, who played Joey the Monkey, was trying to, convince him to stay. And he unsuccessfully. And I could hear them kind of getting loud in the next room as we were shooting the show, because Sammy, part of the deal was we were going to cover his cab fare there and back, and he was insisting on his $5 to take a cab back. And John was telling him, "Well, you're not doing the show. Why would we do that?" So I think he stormed off, and I don't think he got his $5.
I think it's pretty telling when your chief negotiator is Joey the Monkey. When he's the guy who's trying to sort of to lower the temperature of things, like that's.
Well, it was a bare bones crew.
Not only a bare bones crew, but one of the very interesting things of going back and watching it, I don't know if it's even in any sort of ostensible chronological order on YouTube. I certainly haven't been watching it that way, but the evolution of the set design is pretty incredible. I mean, it never looked like there was a big budget, but it was so bare bones in the early days.
Yeah, well, we did. We shot at 3 different studios, and over the 10 years. And the first studio we used was way up at the northern tip of Manhattan, and that was the one that was more bare bones. It was such a long hike for us that we couldn't. There was only so much stuff we could carry, because all that stuff that you'd see on the set was all packed into bags and lugged into the studio. So we were able to add more and more stuff as the show moved down closer to where we were all living, and things just evolved with the show. We kind of developed some things, including the chaos of the set, that just kind of developed more and more over time.
Talk about having a small window of time. How long did it take to set it up every time?
We would have a very small window because, these studios, they were privately owned studios, and they would charge, I think initially we paid $54.13 for a half hour.
So wait, so was it through the station, or this was an independent studio?
They were independent studios. There were basically the original studio was provided by the cable company, but that shut down pretty early on. And then the 2 studios that we kind of went back and forth between were privately owned. They were set up to meet the demand of people that needed a place to create their shows. So they would book like a whole day, almost, back to back every half hour. So we would get very little time, basically about 10 minutes, and all of us would just spread out and just put something anywhere, any blank space you find, put something up. And we'd grab any furniture we could find. Sometimes, if they'd be in office with an old easy chair, and we'd drag that in, and just trying to fill everything up as much as we could in a very short period of time. So yeah, that chaos, that chaotic look of the set was partly because it was created in chaos.
The other celebrity interview that I watched last night that I was alluding to that in some senses was sort of the polar opposite of Soleil Moon Frye. And I was genuinely shocked to see that you had Quentin Crisp on the show.
Well, I was amazed by the whole thing. When I was told it was going to be made into a television play, I thought it was a joke. Then when I found it was serious, I was even more amazed.
Quentin, who was really a really sweet guy, Quentin was known in New York he lived in a little basement apartment in the Lower East Side of New York. And despite his fame, he was in the phone book. And if somebody called him and said, would you like to go out for tea or dinner, or he would do it. And so it really wasn't challenging to book Quentin on the show. I think Quentin was among the guests that just seemed genuinely confused and at times almost disdainful of what was going on around him. But at the time I had a car, and that was when we were shooting way uptown, and I drove him back from the studio, and he was still very pleasant and seemed happy. So I don't know. I think, there was like a moment on the show where he's we had a mother-daughter comedy team, and he's looking at them with just confusion and just, and so I guess it just, maybe he was more puzzled than anything else. He wasn't accustomed to some of those guests that we had alongside him.
Coco and Penny.
Yes, Coco and Penny. Yes.
I watched them last night, and they do have a Facebook page. So they're perhaps around to a certain degree. It was very interesting watching the three of you watch them. The camera cuts back to you for a pretty long amount of time. And, you and David are obviously in character. So David probably doesn't crack a smile the entirety of the series. And I think your character at the time was kind of just general confusion. And then you're flanking Quentin, and he's stone-faced as well. But then after they finish, you ask him something along the lines of like, what did you think of that? And he gives some, very constructive and positive feedback. It was really incredible to watch.
Yeah. And I, David genuinely was not likely entertained by them, I'm guessing. And we just lost Coco about 2 years ago, I think. Yeah. And I don't think Penny is working solo anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, and you mentioned the cameras, and, one of the guys that worked on the show through all the years, my friend Steve Korn, he was always in the director's booth, and he was, the guy that was, while that's going on, I really want to see this person and how they're reacting to it, and what's going through it. Because in some cases it was those people were really playing the part of, people at home that were just maybe kind of looking the same puzzled way and trying to, figure it out and assess what they were looking at, because these weren't typical stand-ups and they weren't typical singers. They're a lot of eccentrics and characters that, were just marching to their own beat. And so anyway, so I think what you're referencing, that idea of Quentin just kind of looking and studying, we always tried to capture that, because that was that was an interesting element to us in the show.
I'll watch something like kind of golden era Howard Stern, and there's some, clearly he was watching, or somebody on staff was watching the show, because they were There was one episode where Underdog Lady and Kenneth Keith Kallenbach were both on the show. So clearly you were feeding into them. Or I'll watch, I don't know how familiar you are with Tim and Eric.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Obviously there's a very strong affinity for some of the cable access stuff. And they have, again, some of those. I don't know if there's any crossover in terms of people who appeared on the show, but obviously they have a strong affinity for it. But the thing that I've always had difficulty with, and I don't know if you struggled with this at all, is walking that line between an affinity for what they do, an understanding that they are in fact eccentric, while not feeling like you're exploiting them.
Yeah, honestly, this goes way back, that this has been the type of programming that has entertained me, right? Like I grew up in high school. I was watching the Uncle Floyd Show, who was like a soupy sales type that we had in the New York area and New Jersey. In high school, when kids were going to concerts at the Nassau Coliseum and stuff, the stuff that I was really drawn to were these performers who were marching to their own beat. And I would go to the downstairs lounge in Rockville Center in Long Island, where they would, it was down at the bottom of a Holiday Inn, and they would have guys like Stryker, who showed up on some of our early shows, and he was writing original songs about Long Island, and, really just with unusual melodies that were just coming out of his head, and lyrics, and so much more entertaining to me than a lot of the more mainstream stuff. So, this show really was an outgrowth of genuine fondness and affection for these performers, and it's in New York in the 80s. We had a lot of these street performers, and there was a guy that would dress up like Uncle Sam and do original songs. We had him on the show, and I never saw it as exploiting. Exploiting in the sense of giving people a platform, and putting them on, but I never felt bad about it, because I genuinely enjoyed the people that we were watching, and I'll listen to the music of some of these performers the way, somebody might put on a favorite album or a favorite station or whatever. Like, it just speaks to me.
Effectively, you were giving them a platform to do what they were doing naturally. I watched what Howard Stern was doing with some of these people, and it's not the same thing.
Oh, in fact, that's uncomfortable to me, and it's challenging to watch, when Suzanne Muldowney, the Underdog woman, who had done many of our shows, once she started doing Howard Stern, and it got really harsh, the way that her appearances would end up on his show. I don't know how much of it was really from Howard, because he seemed to really like her, genuinely like her, but just being in that environment was a bad fit for her. And I never wanted to have someone like Suzanne on and disparage her, because I really admire what she does. She does these her outfits and her capes with all this intricate sewing. She's really gifted, in a lot of ways. I always wanted everyone appearing on the show to feel they were being celebrated. And eventually I went over to become a producer at Jimmy Kimmel Live, and we used to have people like Suzanne on, and we did a segment called Future Talent Showcase. And it was the same thing, where they would be given, their minute or so to perform, and then Jimmy would interview them. And it was all done with, love and admiration. And, Jimmy's a big collector of folk art, so I think there definitely was a part of him that really, appreciated what these people were doing.
I don't know if we call it outsider art anymore, but that's what you would have referred to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's also coming from the angle of being a big Howard Stern fan too. So I don't know if that's how you ended up being on the show at all. Was that connection?
Well, I started at Jimmy Kimmel Live. I had, when I first moved to LA, after I'd been in New York for a number of years, I had gotten in touch with Tom Arnold, who had been on Beyond Vaudeville. And he said, "Oh, wow, I'm actually getting ready to host a pilot for a new version of The Gong Show." And The Gong Show was a huge inspiration for me, like the original one with Chuck Barris. So I did. I worked on that pilot. Unfortunately, it didn't get picked up. But I met another producer there who ended up working at Jimmy Kimmel Live, a guy, Jason Schrift. And I ran into him. He was walking his dog in LA. And I was like, "Oh, Jason, how you doing?" And he looked at me and I was like, what's going on? And he said, "You would be just the right guy for our human interest. We need a new person." And I was like, "Oh, of course," it was work. And it was fantastic. It was just all these people, Izzy Fertel, the Tiny Tim's protege, Suzanne. Oh my God, there were so many people that this guy, Bob 3-3, all these eccentric performers. And it was ones that I got to know through doing that show. There was Linda and Gerald Polly from North Dakota who were channeling the music of John Lennon from The Afterlife. It really was, it was great. We had it was very early on at Jimmy Kimmel Live, and there was a lot of room for experimentation, and Jimmy kind of was, he was totally on board with, treating them all respectfully and giving them their platform. And ABC, who knows if they even knew what we were doing in that sandbox at that point,
And I think just the mere fact that you are in touch with some of them, and that at very least, you continue to track their careers, is a sign that you do genuinely appreciate what they do.
Oh yeah. 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 I mean, otherwise there's just no way, because, a lot of the guests we've had, required a lot of patience, booking Suzanne and, repeatedly, it was a lot of work, so it really, if I didn't enjoy it or enjoy being with them, I never would have done it. It would have been too much work for too little return.
Was Oddville in New York?
Oddville was in New York also. After 10 years of doing the public access show, it really felt like it was winding down. I was kind of ready to move on and stop doing it. And then, of course, get a call from MTV and asking if we wanted to come in and do a version of the show for MTV. So, of course, we jumped at it, and we ended up shooting 66 episodes. And it was challenging because we had to do it in a short period of time. Everyone had to come from the New York area. We didn't have a budget to fly people in. So, and we were shooting multiple shows a day, up to 3 episodes a day with a celebrity, a band, and anywhere between, I don't know, usually about a half dozen guests. So it was a tall order. We were able to bring on guests that we had over the years on the original show, but we, had to search wider. So we ended up going and doing auditions at colleges and finding, people like Eugene, the human doormat, who liked to lay down, put a doormat on his body and have people vacuum him. There were more people to be found. We discovered, but it was a lot we had to book.
I mean, I would say, even in spite of the tight turnaround, there's a level of spontaneity that you're just not going to get on MTV in the same way.
Oh yeah, I mean, nothing. I've been working now since Beyond Vaudeville and in commercial TV, and it's rare that you can get the real pure expression and freedom from notes that you get in the professional world. That public access show was a very pure expression of what we wanted to do, and there weren't other people giving us. No one was giving us notes. The only notes we got were letters to our PO box from viewers, saying what they liked. But there was a lot about it that was really fun creatively from that point.
If you are interested in watching the show, there's an active YouTube channel that has, I think it's mostly Beyond Vaudeville, but it are also Oddville episodes on there, and it's clear looking at them that as you were having conversations with MTV, they had some notes early on. Number one, fairly professional band playing at the ends. I think Blink-182 is on, insofar as Blink-182 is a professional band, on the end of one. And then they brought in a new co-host as well. It's clear that they were going after a specific demographic that maybe Beyond Vaudeville didn't cater to.
Yeah, I mean, we never, obviously, when we did Beyond Vaudeville, there was no pressure to, have younger guests in the mix. I mean, to MTV's credit, they did. There wasn't any kind of age limit. We did have a lot of old timers on there, which was like hard to believe, given that it was MTV and their demographics. And, but yeah, we had Melissa, the female announcer, was added. I had to dye my hair, even though I had, started going gray in high school. But that had to happen.
Were you not dyeing your hair on Beyond Vaudeville? Was that was real gray?
No. I started going gray, like at 16, and so yeah. So, but when it came time for MTV, it was like no gray haired people on MTV. Certainly not hosting a show. So yeah. So there definitely were changes, and yes, having to have also the celebrity guest and the band, they were both booked by MTV's departments, so we would end up working with whoever was booked. They worked out in a lot of cases, and a lot of these people went on to a lot of success, a lot of the bands, but yeah, I mean, they weren't typical. They wouldn't have been typical bookings for us by any means when we were doing the Beyond Vaudeville.
I would think that at that level, on a station like that, when you're dealing with professional actors, a lot of folks you had on were coming from TV shows, that they would almost feel necessary to prep them for what was going to go on.
Yeah, I mean, because in that case, those guests on Oddville and MTV were booked by the MTV talent department. So I'm not sure what their process was, but, in terms of if they, gave them any, well, they probably didn't have any clips to show the people because we had to shoot the whole bulk of them in a period of like, 2 months or something. So
the full season, like a season at a time.
Yeah. I mean, it really, it's the only way to make the numbers work in TV is to just, shoot a lot of them as you have the studio and the crew all together. And yeah, so it's not like they even had video to show the guests unless they showed them beyond vaudeville, but that's probably unlikely because that probably would have scared off a lot of people. But there were times when like we had the band Chibo Motto on, and Sean Lennon was dating one of the women in the band, and so he came on to perform with them, and he sought us out when he got to the studio because he had been a big fan of the show when it was on in New York. And that would happen every so often, even though it was public access at that time had a pretty high profile in New York. There'd be, it was always surprising the number of people that we would discover watch the show and would approach us in the street, or if we did a live show somewhere, the turnout we would get would be, significant. It was, people really had an affection for public access at that time. It was the YouTube of the 80s.
Beyond Vaudeville last, I think you said about 10 years. Oddville was on, 2 seasons?
It was actually on 1 season. It was on for probably about a year because we aired every night at 7:30 and 11, I think, or 7:30 and 11:30. And then they would rerun them. So, but that was essentially 1 season, 66 episodes.
I'm in New York now, but I grew up in the Bay Area.
Mm-hmm.
So I was not familiar, I think, with Beyond Vaudeville until fairly recently, and rediscovered it. Of all things, I was looking for Sammy Petrillo interviews.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Very, very, very well, he appeared on a couple times.
Well, actually, one time I was Jerry Lewis, but I decided that it's like winning the Academy Award. You don't get that many jobs once you're a star. See? So I just changed my name to Sammy Petrillo so I can do shows like this, work nightclubs here and there, and an occasional bar mitzvah. It
was that interesting thing of feeling like Beyond Vaudeville was kind of familiar, and then discovering Oddville and realizing that, oh yeah, that this is just a sort of a weird thing that I had seen that was existed somewhere in my brain. I know you said that Beyond Vaudeville wasn't necessarily an outlier from other cable access shows that were going out at the time, but Oddville was absolutely an outlier from the other things that were happening on MTV. Was it not a good fit ultimately? Why did it only last that 1 year?
Yeah, they did a lot of experimentation that year. It was a big year of experimentation. They did their first.
Would this have been like Liquid Television era?
Yeah, that was there. There was a show called Austin Stories that was scripted comedy drama. They did a sitcom called Apartment 2F with the Sklar brothers, like a 3-camera sitcom with an audience. It was just it was a year of experimentation, and they launched something called the 10 Spot, and it was going to be starting at 10 p.m. And it was us and these other shows, and it just it was the reality of MTV at that time, it probably still is that their audience was predominantly tween girls, like girls ages 12 to 14, and and that, so, something like us in that environment is just weird, like, I don't know. I mean, now you mentioned Tim and Eric earlier, Eric Andre has mentioned us as an influence.
Adult Swim shows were clearly pretty influenced.
Yeah. I mean, Tim and Eric, they would have this guy on, James Quall, who, James didn't have an act until I met him. I met him he was at a Hollywood Collectors show out here in Studio City, and at the Holiday Inn, and started talking him up because he just seemed like an interesting guy and eccentric. And I was working at Jimmy Kimmel Live at the time, and so I'm talking to him, and I would often do this if I found someone who was interesting at a comic convention or on the street or in a store. I would just start talking to them and find out if they had some sort of hidden talent, or if they had some dream of maybe one day being a singer, or if all else failed, I'd say, well, come on anyway, and we'll call you a raconteur, or we'll call you a science. You like Star Trek, so we'll make you a Star Trek expert.
A ventriloquist dummy.
Yes, So I was having a similar discussion with James Quall, and all of a sudden he reveals that he's really into beach movies from the 1950s and 60s. And I was like, oh, this is interesting.
Frankie and Annette kind of.
Yeah. Beach Ball and all those, those movies that, most people, if you ask them, well, what's your favorite genre of movies, or what are your favorite movies? It's The Godfather, it's whatever. And this guy is saying the beach movies, from the 60s, which were throwaways, most of them, right? They were just, and I said, oh, really? And he said, yes. And actually, I've written a couple of screenplays about these movies. I was like, really? And
you wrote spec scripts.
Yes, he wrote spec scripts for a genre that had been gone for 50 years.
There was Back to the Beach. I will correct you on that.
That's true. That's true. And he had written original songs for them. So I brought him in to audition, and he didn't make it. He didn't make the cut. But then, fast forward a couple of years later, I see on Tim and Eric, there's James Quall singing one of his beach songs. And I was like, wow, I'm glad they saw it and saw a platform for him.
You had alluded to the fact earlier that by the time MTV came along, you were ready to hang it up and I guess probably move on to the next thing. But even in that case, it has to be difficult to suddenly have this huge national, or I guess international platform, and then a year later it's gone.
Well, it was disappointing. I mean, we were hoping to keep going because we couldn't even, when you have to produce the entire run in that short a period of time, there's no room for adjusting, really. So, a lot of shows, if they get past that, if they can get over the hump of that first season, I don't know if you remember in the early days of Conan O'Brien, like it was just, they were going to pull the plug every few months. It would have been great to get a chance to, tweak it a little bit but it offered me an opportunity to kind of cross over into commercial TV. And, I got to do a lot of interesting things, continue to get to do a lot of interesting things in TV. And I did, right after that, I was doing a recurring segment on the Daily Show where I was introducing public access clips.
This Craig Kilborn era?
For the last year of Craig and the first year of John, I was there, and then I moved out to LA. It would be this recurring segment called Public Access, and they're all out there, the Comedy Central's website, and just showing clips from my vast collection that I, would record off air from the public access channels, and, just making little comments about the clips. And it continues this human interest type booking. I've just, it's played into a lot of the shows that I've worked on. And and in other ways too, like I ended up working on Fear Factor, like producing all the gross stuff on the show. And that came about because I had a meeting. No one knew what that show was supposed to be. It was supposed to be a bomb. We were a mid-season.
With some guy from News Radio that has not been heard from since.
Yes. Yeah. That guy, what was his name? But yeah, so nothing about that show made sense, and The network didn't know what the hell it was, and it just succeeded in spite of all that. But on my interview, they said, this isn't going to sound weird now, but at the time it was weird. They were like, well, this show is going to involve people eating bugs, and how do you feel about that? And I said, well, on Oddville, we had just had an insectivore on the show and eating live crickets, and that was it. I got the job. So, I've been able to find those ins in TV where there's a little room for something a little different. So not quite as different as Beyond Vaudeville, but
you've had a very charmed career in terms of, of meeting the right people at the right time. Would you say though, in hindsight overall, that Oddville was a good experience for you?
Oddville was definitely a good experience because it's where I learned real production versus Beyond Vaudeville. I could still be doing Beyond Vaudeville today and weighing myself down with a bunch of, suitcases filled with props and going into a cheap studio. And I guess I'd probably be doing it on YouTube now, but I like that I've been able to do work professionally and work in a professional environment. So, Oddville definitely opened up doors for me that way. And there definitely were a lot of moments in Oddville that I really love and am really proud of, so yeah. But Beyond Vaudeville that's really the firstborn, that always has a special place in my heart.
Sure, and a pure vision. It was right from your brain or the group of your brain onto the set, which is not something you get on MTV. And certainly, as I hear Jay Leno is a very nice guy, but there's a lot of executives and everything else you have to deal with. I love that it's all back online and that, that I've been able to spend time with it. And it does really makes a lot of sense in YouTube. As you said, there's an analog there, and we connected through the Facebook group that you have. It seems like there's a sense in which lately you've kind of been reconnecting with the old shows. Well,
we put the shows up on YouTube, and just to kind of keep them alive, and we were thrilled to see that people started discovering it, people like yourself and people from other parts of the world that just never had access to it, never saw any shows from the 80s on public access, and a younger generation that, don't even know some of these legends like Imogene Coca and Professor Erwin Corey. And, so it's, and weirdly, I'm finding like with younger people that are responding to the show, I think in some ways they can relate more to those shows than what, networks are currently trying to produce. Because the networks today are producing largely for, an older audience, like what's left of audiences in broadcast TV. It tends to be an older crowd, and, that kind of loose feel that is more akin to, YouTube and Twitter and Instagram. It's just, it does kind of weirdly speak to like a new generation.
One of the things that I also stumbled on in the process was an interview that you and David did at a festival fairly recently, both in character. Was that the first time Frank Cope had returned since Oddville?
Yeah, I would say pretty much. We were invited by Philomoka. It's this really great performance space in Philadelphia, and there's a guy there. The guy that runs it, Eric Bresler, was reached out again through, he discovered the show on YouTube and Facebook and invited us out there to just kind of, get the band back together, and for one night. And we show up there, and they were really just so nice to us. They flew us out there, and we get into the space, and there's like a complete recreation of the set that they just did on their own, right down to like the Mr. T head on the desk. They really did a great job with it. And fortunately, Suzanne, Underdog Lady, was she lives in that region, so she was able to come on as a guest. And we had a guy, Stanless Steele, who was a strong man from that area, who came on Oddville a couple of times, and another guy who had done a song about he did original songs about Chinese food and other interesting topics. Anyway, we got to just do the show again. It was really fun. People were very receptive to it, and even though we never aired in Philadelphia, but there was a good audience there and supportive. So I guess they were finding it, through the internet. Was it easy to step back into those shoes? Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, you do something for 10 years. Yeah, it's, it definitely is something we both slipped very comfortably back into.